Good evening and welcome to the New Hampshire Interfaith Collaborative. This is a project that has been going on for several months, collaboration with a number of different organizations and people involved in faith communities. My name is Dr. Andy Diaz and I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer at St. Anselm College. It's a small Catholic college, Benedictine tradition here in Manchester. I'm standing in for my colleague and friend Dr. Sue Gabert, who was to serve as moderator for this evening. And those of you who know Sue would know that she had planned to explain that the interfaith collaborations have been holding these conversations since December about different kinds of topics. So for example, faith and race, COVID health disparities. We had a wonderful conversation there, really helping inform residents in New Hampshire. White nationalism and hate groups in New Hampshire was another topic we had conversations about. And all of those conversations were about content, and they were designed to help inform New Hampshire residents and to increase our civic knowledge. So they were very content focused. Tonight's event is different because what we're doing tonight is we're focusing on identifying barriers and being intentional about the skills that we need to practice for engaging in difficult but faith-filled conversations about difficult topics. I will say just some quick housekeeping items. There we go. So Dr. Andy Diaz, and I'll be introducing our facilitators in just one moment. Just a couple of housekeeping items. First, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute yourself except when you're speaking, just to help minimize some background sounds. So if your dog's barking, we don't share that together. You can also rename yourself if you'd like to add a pronoun or maybe your organization or house of worship. You're welcome to do that. You can do that under the participants, your name there. Mute is the lower left. Just click on the little microphone and you'll have a red strike across it indicating that you're muted. And then lastly, we understand that at times you'll need to turn off your camera, but it does help build our engagement space. So if you can leave it on as much as possible, that's appreciated by the facilitators. Reverend Jason Wells is working behind the scenes, providing our technical assistance. And so thank you, Reverend Wells. Let me also add that because many of us are having thunder and lightning storms, if you lose your signal, or if you find that people are frozen that you're trying to watch or listen to, just exit and go back in, and Reverend Wells will readmit you, so that might help. We've done what we can to have multiple hosts on this, so if it goes down, we'll all go down together, but we've got as many backup plans as we can given the weather. So thank you so much. So before I introduce our extraordinary facilitators, let me just pose the question, what do we mean by difficult discussion topics? What do we mean? I'm going to look at the chat mark. People can pop things in the chat. That's probably one way to handle a large number like this. So feel free in your chat. Just what do we mean? What are some topics? Difficult topics. And conversations that make us uncomfortable. Great. More. Let's see what else people have. What other things? Okay. Topics of disagreement. What are other things? Voter suppression, systemic racism, exactly, more, reparations, right? These are all topics where, we know we want to be able to talk about them. Gender identity, white privilege, reparations, again, excellent. We got many, many topics. What words are appropriate? Sexism, paternalism. So what I'm going to do is just share with you a list that we've put together, and James, I'll let you put that in there. So these are just some examples, and you've mentioned some of these yourselves already. Colonialism, thank you. Teaching kids. So how do I call out someone who makes racist remarks? Should we strive to live in a colorblind society? How do we discuss affinity groups? What's happening in my own faith group around race? Or what are some of the difficult conversations in my faith organization? How do we have these conversations when some white folks don't believe that systemic racism exists, or they might think that focusing on it could be divisive? What happens during a discussion when white people or any of us get overwhelmed by guilt or by the things we've said or discussions? How can we have conversations move on productively to practical responses? So other examples, the discourse around Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, HB 54 legislation in our state going forward, and the meaning of the Confederate flag and how it's read by different communities and stakeholders. And we could go on and on. So these are the kinds of difficult topics that we can imagine. We want to just basically begin to name those types of things And again, tonight's session is not going to be about focusing on any one of these discussions. It's going to be about how do we frame the conversations? How do we identify the barriers? How do we practice the kinds of skills that are needed to have conversations of any of these natures? So fortunately, these topics, as you know, they're not for the faint of heart, but fortunately we have two exceptional scholar practitioners with us this evening to help us. First, I'm delighted to bring you Dr. Dottie Morris. And those of you who don't know Dottie, she's Associate Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Keene State, where she also teaches psychology. I'm just one of many who count on Dottie for wise counsel over the years. Mr. James McKim. James chairs the Episcopalian Church National Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism and Reconciliation. That is a mouthful, but the Episcopalian Church National Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism and Reconciliation. And James also serves as president of the NAACP chapter here in Manchester. Both of these colleagues I could go on and on about, but I've witnessed Dottie's work firsthand, and I've seen James, his skill facilitating with senior organizational leaders. So we are in very good hands, and I'm really grateful for that. So Dottie and James are going to guide us through an agenda, and you see that agenda in front of you. So from setting the table through skills and possible responses, all for you to think about your own faith and personal communities. And again, we want to make sure that we're bringing the perspective to our faith communities and those spheres that we might be able to influence in ways as we have these conversations. So Dr. Morris, could you set the table for us?
Always love a good food metaphor here. So setting the table is important. Setting the table is very important when we do this work. And with 4 tips, right quick, of things that you would want to do even before the conversation starts, and then definitely at the first meeting. So the most important thing is to prepare yourself as the facilitator. You really want to get in touch with whatever things trigger you. I've been doing this work for a very long time. And so what I've learned is so critical is kind of self-reflection is so key to doing this work and trying to do it effectively. Because if I get triggered in the process of helping others facilitate, it could have a major impact on how effective that dialogue will take place. So it's really important for you as a facilitator to always engage in self-reflection. I'd like to co-facilitate, because then that way the other person could definitely take up some slack if we need to. Also, it's really helpful for debriefing and for meeting ahead of time. Even to do this presentation, we met several times to talk some things through. And I know we'll probably debrief, because there's always something better we can do. Another thing we think is important is to create some type of activity when the group first gets together, because a lot of people are running around and we're moving so fast now. And the activity is just to make sure that people are in the room, that they are present, that they are mentally present, that they're able to leave back what they did for the day, to be available. So sometimes what I've done is I've had people pair off and just discuss 2 simple questions so they could connect with each other. And so those are the 2 questions: how you're staying motivated and connected, and how are you keeping yourself healthy. And people just go off and have that conversation. Again, we're trying to bring them into the room and have them connect with at least one other person early on. Make sure at the very beginning, you lay out the purpose, because sometimes people have different ideas as to why you're having the dialogue. And needless to say, that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding. So you want to be sure that you talk to your group about what is the purpose? Why are we coming together? And what are some potential outcomes that we would want to see collectively? And the last thing is to have an agreement among the participants about expectations for having the dialogue or in the dialogue space. So what are some things that everyone would need in order to feel as though they could be active participants? So these are just 4 kind of tips that we would like to give you. Usually you get tipped after the meal, but we're giving you some tips before the meal. So I'll turn it over to my dear colleague, James.
Thank you, Dottie, and thank you everyone for being here. And listening to Dottie talk about setting the table, you know, it's interesting when we ask the question, what's a difficult conversation? There are difficult conversations in groups, and there are difficult one-on-one conversations. And so the setting the table that Dottie was really just talking about was focused on setting the table for difficult conversations in groups, right? Preparing for the dialogue, and the facilitator facilitates discussions in groups, right? But there are also the one-on-one conversations that happen. And many of you shared topics that are one-on-one conversations. I would say that the same kind of setting the table thoughts are valid on one-on-one conversations, just as they are for group conversations. It's just that you don't have a facilitator. You're going to be in the conversation with one other person, right? So you still prepare yourself for the dialogue. You think about what's going on emotionally. How are you keeping yourself prepared? Thinking, understanding. We're going to talk about this shared understanding later, and having agreements, if you can, on how you're going to engage in the conversation. I'd like to start off with just talking about some communication basics. You know, communication is between two people, right? And there's a physical perspective, a physical aspect of communication in that there is a sender of a message and a receiver of a message. So with that notion, and this comes from the Shannon and Weaver model of communications, just a question for you to ponder. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the message gets across? Is it the sender's responsibility or the receiver's responsibility? Think about that for a minute. Whose responsibility is it for a message, to make sure a message gets across? Is it the sender's responsibility or the receiver's responsibility? And we have a both from Gina. Anyone else? Of course, both. So what I'm going to suggest, and this comes from the Shannon and Weaver model, that it is the sender's responsibility. That's right, Melinda. The sender's responsibility to make sure the message gets across. Now, why is that? That's because only the sender knows what that message is. The receiver doesn't know. The receiver is only guessing. Only the sender knows. So it's the sender's responsibility to make sure that the message gets across. And what gets us into trouble is that the sender, the person who's uttering the message, has a background, a set of understandings, a set of beliefs, a culture that they come from, and the words that they use are a product of who they are. The receiver also has a culture, a set of experiences. And the words that are coming to them may or may not mean the same thing because of the difference in the cultural background and experience. So the sender, and this is where we talk about the difference between intent and impact. I can say something and I have an intent for that, but the impact may be totally different from what I intended. So it's only the sender who knows what the intent was. And yes, the receiver needs to provide feedback of what the impact is so the sender knows that the message has actually gotten across. Now, on top of just that physical back and forth, there's also this notion that, as research has shown, meaning is derived 7% from the actual words. 7% from the actual words. The way that the words are articulated and expressed, the paralinguistics, makes up 38% of how the meaning comes across. And 55% of the meaning comes from the facial expressions of the person who's uttering the words. So just the words themselves don't necessarily articulate all of the meaning. And miscommunication comes from interpreting of meaning, right? Different interpretations of meaning. So we need to be cognizant of the way we speak our facial expressions in trying to communicate a message to someone. So if the physical communication differences and the way that meaning is derived wasn't enough, we also have to think about thinking styles. Ted Herman, in his whole brain thinking model, articulates that there are 4 different thinking styles that we exhibit. A logical style, which is where we focus on facts and figures in the bottom line. A creative style, where we see the big picture and we like to turn everything into fun. And then there's a relational style, where we focus on the feelings of our feelings and the feelings of the others with whom we're in a conversation. And then there's the practical thinking style, where, like me, I'm a great organizer. I focus on organizing and follow through. Now, what Herman said is that it's not that we have only one thinking style. We actually can exhibit all of these thinking styles. But when we are pressed, when we are stressed, when we're in an emotional conversation, we have a go-to thinking style. We have a default thinking style. So for me, my default is practical. But just think, if you are a logical person and you love facts and figures and you're in a conversation and you're spouting off facts and figures, but you're talking to a relational person who focuses in on feelings, their feelings and your feelings, what's happening for them is the facts and figures are going into one ear and out the other. So they're not hearing you. Even though you may speak louder, they're still not hearing you because the facts and figures don't mean anything to them. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that we do have these different thinking styles when we get pressured, and sometimes these difference in thinking styles mean that the meaning doesn't make sense to us. The impact is different than the intent. And even when the impact is the same as the intent, there is this concept of cognitive dissonance that gets into the way. And that's where the data that we're observing doesn't match with our values or beliefs. We are torn, and we tend to default to believing our facts, our values, and beliefs rather than the data that's in front of us. So there's some techniques that we're going to be talking about to help you get through this cognitive dissonance and make sure that meaning actually comes across. So next, based on great work done by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen, in a book that they wrote called Difficult Conversations, which is a must-read. It's changed my way of thinking about how I approach conversations. They talk about the fact that every difficult conversation has 3 conversations going on inside it. The first conversation is about the facts. And if you're old enough to remember the Dragnet show, Joe Friday's phrase was, "Just the facts, ma'am." So, right? So the facts of the matter. What actually happened? What was the plot? Who's right? What was the intent? And who's to blame? So that's one conversation that's going on. And if you think about the thinking styles that we just talked about, the logical thinking style, this is what is predominantly playing out in the minds of a logical thinker. The next component of this is feelings. We all have feelings even though we might not recognize it. And so one of the 3 conversations that's going on in our brains as we have these difficult conversations is, what are the feelings that are happening? If I say something to you that you find offensive, then you let me know that. What's going through my mind is, oh, am I competent? Am I a good person? This person doesn't like what I said. Do they like me? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of love? So that's the second conversation that's going on. The third conversation is about my identity. I'm sorry, I misspoke a little bit. The identity question is, am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of love? The feelings are about, am I going to let my feelings take over in this conversation? Are my feelings dictating what's going on? Or am I listening really for the person, for what the person is actually saying, and the meaning of those words? So these three conversations are going on in every difficult conversation. What will help us to address the conversations and to have more productive conversations, we'll start off with is conversational norms. Setting the stage, right? As Dottie said up front, setting expectations for how the conversation should take place, if you can. And you can't always do that with difficult conversations. Sometimes you're just in the moment and you're in that conversation. But if you can set the stage, here are some norms that you might think about putting in place. First, stay engaged. The conversations are difficult, they're emotional, and we generally tend to turn away from difficult conversations when they're emotional. But we need to stay engaged if we're going to work through it. Next, share airtime. If you say something, let the other person speak. If you're in a group, let 2 or 3 other people speak before you speak again. Right? Don't hog that airtime. Next, be patient with yourself and others. Be patient with yourself and others. With these emotional topics, there may be concepts being shared that you don't have any life experience with, that will be difficult for you to understand and grasp. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You just don't have the experience, right? So be patient with yourself, and others the same. Others may not have experience with what you're saying. They may not grasp it quickly. Be patient with them. Next, speak your truth as you're able. Use I statements. Speak your truth. Do not try to speak someone else's truth. Next, notice your judgments. Notice your judgments. We're not saying don't have judgments. We're suggesting that you notice your judgments, because noticing your judgments allows you to notice when you are assuming something. Next, we are all teachers and we're all learners. We all have something to teach and we all have something to learn. And this is a takeoff from the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford University in her growth mindset work. Next.
James, you muted yourself.
Oh, I don't know what happened. I was just talking along. Where did I go muted?
When you said
just a sentence ago.
Yeah, it was about a sentence.
Okay, so I started on respect, confidentiality.
Right now.
Right after that? Okay. So if you can set the stage for confidentiality in your discussions, creating what Dr. Eric Law calls a gracious space, then people will feel free to express themselves so that you can truly understand them and not make assumptions about what they're saying. Next, expect and accept non-closure. These difficult conversations have been going on about race for 400 years plus. We're not going to change our culture in a day, in a month, in a year, probably totally within our lifetimes. Expect and accept non-closure. But that doesn't mean you don't try to have the conversations that come to some resolution. Sometimes in conversations, you can come to a resolution. And the tools we're going to give will help you. Lastly, but not least, oops and ouch. If you say something, and as soon as it leaves your lips, you recognize that it wasn't quite what you intended, you can say oops. And that lets the other people in the room or the other person in the conversation know you said something that you didn't mean to say, or it didn't come out just the way you wanted it. And you can unpack that now. For the ouch, if you hear something, if someone says something that lands on you inappropriately or lands on you uncomfortably, you can say, ouch. That's not judgmental. It's just letting the other person know, or the speaker know, that something that they said didn't land on them, and they have an opportunity to explain or expound a little bit more. So these are some conversational norms we use in groups, and you can even think about using them in your one-on-one conversations to set the stage for a common set of ground rules for having a productive conversation. All right, so I've thrown a lot at you, and I think we're going to stop the recording now because we're going to get into some discussion.
Great. Thank you.